Well, I'm delighted to be here this afternoon at our second panel for this wonderful workshop that was initiated by several of us thinking about the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, and then grew into a larger consideration of children's traumas and difficulties, displacements, etc. One of the things that we were very clear about from the get-go is that we wanted to talk about schooling, especially given the experience of children during this COVID period. And this is the panel that we now have. And this has been an experimental workshop since it combines in-person and Zoom. And this is the session where we really take off. We have two of our distinguished panelists who are on Zoom, and two of the panelists who are here in person. And I'm going to introduce all of them in the order in which they will appear. And I'm not going to tell you anything more about them because all of that is described in your leaflets. We're going to start with Jonathan Zimmerman, and then Lorna Hermosura. And then we're going to take a very short break, 5 minutes or so. And then we're going to talk with Amanda Littauer and Katherine Newman. So we get one Zoom per part of session, okay? And I think that Bengt wants to say something too. We're co-chairing this particular panel.
But I don't really have anything to add to this.
Okay. Well, then let me just say that we're lucky that we have this particular panel now. We just got, over the last couple of weeks, information about the educational setback of American children as a result of COVID, and it is a knockout. Every single state in the union, children who were tested at 4th and 8th grade, have lost significant learning since the pandemic began. That doesn't even need my commentary, but it does need Jonathan's commentary. So, Jonathan?
But I could also add then, before we let in Jonathan, that this actualizes also international comparisons, because the question is to the uniqueness of the American experience in an international light, which we will be able to touch upon a little bit, at least, I think. Thank you, Jonathan.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, and thanks to Paula and Steve for engaging me in this conference. I'm really sorry I can't be there, and I'm also sorry that I can't participate in the other events digitally because I'm at the History of Education Society meetings, where I played a leadership role in the organization, and so the rest of the weekend is just kind of doing that, and I'm in a dingy hotel room in Baltimore. But I'm glad that I can join you at least for this time, for this, I think, hugely important moment and hugely important topic. I also have a little bit of mea culpa, which is that I have to say that I'm not where I wanted to be on my research about this topic. There's a little bit of a meta dimension to that because I was envisioning doing all this archival research, which for some pretty obvious pandemic-related reasons I was unable to do. What I was mostly doing, and really where the book comes from, just at the most personal and honest level, is supporting my wife, who's an infectious disease physician. And all books essentially come from your family, I think, because that's where you come from. And this one certainly did. You know, she was and is the liaison between Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, her employer, and the city health department. So she was absolutely at the epicenter, or perhaps herself the epicenter, of the city's response to the pandemic. And, it was a humbling experience for me watching what she did. It would be as if everyone in America and the world wanted to know about the history of schools and universities and wanted to know, like, tonight, or people would die. In other words, not an experience that I'm ever going to have. And it was also, it was energizing, but it was very sobering and demoralizing at the same time. And I think, more to the thrust of our discussions and also my modest comments here, every night she did a different Zoom with a school board or a school leader. And it became a joke in our family because after about a month, I could have given her talk. The Q&A, that's a different thing. But the bullet points, I could repeat them right now. And, then we would have dinner and we would say, now, why exactly did you give exactly the same talk to that school district as the one before? And why are 13,000 school districts creating their own COVID policy? The answer, of course, is that we don't have a public health system any more than we have an education system, right? We have a million different nodes. Million is an exaggeration, but thousands and thousands of them, which sometimes coordinate but often don't. And it turns out that that's really thus far been the focus of this book that I'm doing. Very briefly, I want to write a book on the history of schools and universities during epidemics. I just got some funding to support it, which is great because now archives are opening up. The major reason I wanted to do this book is I wanted to write the prehistory of what Susan was experiencing, that's my wife, as she advised all these schools and also universities about what to do and not to do. And it turned out that this book doesn't exist, which I found quite surprising. I'm sure that 11 other people are working on it right now. But I'm calling it Infectious Lessons because what I want to do in the project is I want to examine both the way that these institutions responded and also the stories that they told about the experience, because that's what I think is so unique about educational institutions. I think in the realm we're talking about, they're both actors and narrators of these crises, right? Obviously, they have to work their way through them as institutions, but they also have to narrate and teach us about them at the same time. And I should tell you that because I haven't been able to get into many archives, I thus far know, I think, much more about the way they've reacted and what they've done, and much less about the stories that they've told. And obviously, these things are related. But the contours of the story will be, I think, already familiar to a lot of people at this meeting. We begin with the smallpox outbreaks in the 17th, 18th century, mainly affecting kind of they were all small colleges like Harvard and Yale. We move into the 19th century and we start talking about cholera and typhoid and diphtheria. The story there is about urbanization and also very much about immigration and about race, because obviously minorities are not just disproportionately affected by these outbreaks, but they're often blamed for them. Most of all, tensions between different kinds of institutions. This was somewhat of a surprise to me, but it's clearly going to be one of the major themes of the book. Because the American state is so diffuse, it isn't just that its different nodes don't coordinate with each other, which is what I learned from Susan. It's that they're often at war with each other. A main theme in this work is the tension between health and educational authorities. And the one thing I'm sure of already is the following dynamic. In the 19th century, health officials wanted to close the schools and school officials wanted to keep them open. And then in the 20th century, it reversed. Health officials wanted to keep the schools open and educators wanted to close them. And I'll just give you some examples here. It turns out in Seattle in the 1890s, one of the biggest events of civil disobedience in the history of the city was a battle over this subject where the health officials tried to close several schools that they said were infested with smallpox. And the teachers and the students broke down the barriers that the health officials had erected and took over the schools. And this happened in a number of different places across Seattle, widely reported in the press. I still haven't gotten into the archives out in Seattle to get more details about it. But it contrasts very sharply with the 20th century, where, again, health officials are more commonly saying, look, keep the schools open. That will make all of us safer. If you close the schools, the kids will be out on the street. It's always the street because that's where the kids are, and they'll be infecting each other. No adult will be watching them, we think, or we say. In the schools, we can do that. But the educators, of course, they're much closer to the voters because the school boards are elected. And, I find them often saying to the health officials, look, I know that, you have this science that suggests that we should keep the schools open. But my constituents, i.e. the parents and families, they don't want that. And they're terrified. And then I'm speaking to you from Baltimore because that's where our meeting is this weekend. But one of my favorite quotes in the story thus far is I actually found this great exchange between a health officer in Baltimore and a whole bunch of very angry teachers and parents. And this health official, not surprisingly to you, a guy, says, with all due respect to the citizens of Charm City who want us to close the schools, why should we have a health department if you don't listen to it? Which is pretty interesting. Yeah. And attached to all of this, of course, is the question of how information is generated, how it's spread, how it's received. And most of all, and connected to all of this, misinformation. So the role of rumor and hearsay in this story is just enormous. And there are countless examples of it. But my favorite one comes out of Galesburg, Illinois, where I find an educator actually saying, the rumors of smallpox are themselves a contagion. And sometimes that was true. Right? I mean, sometimes there was radical exaggeration, but of course, the sociologists in the room will, tell us that, we can infect each other with contagious misinformation, just as we can with a disease. And that certainly happened in some places. Another example that I love comes out of Los Angeles in the early 20th century, where a kindergarten teacher gets smallpox and she's quarantined. And then the rumors spread through the city that she's dead and that ghosts are haunting the school. She's not in the school. She's quarantined, but a lot of families refuse to send their kid there. Not, as best I can tell, because they thought that it was infected with smallpox, but they thought that her ghost was there. So the way that information moves through all of this, I think, is going to be really interesting and complicated. Sorry? I'm extremely sorry. I couldn't hear what you said.
It's not coming from us, Jonathan. Okay, that's coming from somewhere else, some interference. I don't think anyone...
Now I can hear Paula.
Yeah, I don't think anyone at this table was speaking to you. So there's something that was coming through, unless it was someone on Zoom. It's Joanna Miklik.
Yeah, but it's... Go ahead, please.
Please proceed.
Okay, all right. And I also wanted to emphasize that every kind of institution, not just public ones, every kind of educational institution has to address this problem, obviously. And the parochial school story is also fascinating. So, the question of even the right of public officials, both health and educational officials, to regulate parochial schools is obviously highly contested and uneven. And you can see this in the epidemic story. In San Francisco in the 1890s, the city tried to close a few parochial schools that had reportedly experienced disease outbreaks. They put red cards saying diphtheria, because that was the disease on the fence. And the local priest comes and pulls them off. Tells the San Francisco Chronicle that it's all a lie. He's arrested. And then he tells the newspaper that San Francisco has worse tyranny than Russia. I think this is pretty interesting. The date is 1899. This is pre-Cold War, right? This isn't communist tyranny. This is just like czarist tyranny. And in Montclair, New Jersey, near New York, they closed, the officials closed the Catholic schools. They said they were infected, and the priests go to the newspapers and say, the public schools are infected too. Why don't you close them? And then the town did. Because there was so much objection on the part of Catholics. Why are you closing down our schools? This also intersected in really interesting ways with labor politics. So in Chicago, the several unions say that they'll keep kids, that is their kids, out of school unless the schools are repainted, because painting was considered a way to prevent epidemics. Yeah. But then I started reading more accounts in the Chicago Tribune, and a lot of people said things like, well, first of all, we don't really know that painting the school is going to make it safer. And maybe, this is really about the painters union, right? Trying to get, more contracts for its workers, which, it certainly might have been. But every school, including fancy private schools, have to deal with this question. And again, the question is, when there's an outbreak, what do you say? What do you report? What do you do? And although I haven't gone to this part yet as much, what story do you tell about it? So just one other example, Groton, right? Very famous New England private school. In 1903, the son of the President of the United States, Teddy Roosevelt Jr., gets extremely ill. There are reports that he's on his deathbed. So Edith Roosevelt, the first lady, she takes a train immediately up to Groton and gets a cot and lies next to the kid. This is Teddy Jr. The president was negotiating the Panama Canal Treaty at the time, so he can't make it. But he comes up on the train the next day, and interestingly, stays with a friend who teaches at Groton. This part I just found, it's so weirdly pre-Secret Service. You just imagine the president showing up. I'm sure he had some guards, but he crashed with his buddy who teaches at Groton. Eventually, the kid gets well, but not until they closed the whole school, because this created such an incredible publicity contretemps. Remember, this is really the first time since Lincoln that there were little kids in the White House. And, this was a very big part of the whole Teddy Roosevelt image. You may have read that, the famous story of Gifford Pinchot showing up at the White House to do some business with the president. And the president is lowering one of his kids out of a second floor window with a rope in an imagined Indian raid. So, the whole question of kids in the White House, right, has this huge symbolic load. And the fact that the president's son might die is an enormous story. So they close Groton. They run a special train to Grand Central. And then the newspapers report that the Groton mothers all assembled at Grand Central Station to meet their boys getting off the train. So again, the way these things are reported and the way they're received, I think, is going to be an enormously kind of interesting, complex thing. And then, oops.
There you go.
And then the college story. I think there's going to be an interesting connection between these prep schools and colleges. Obviously, the prep schools are feeders for colleges. They're boarding situations, and that creates an entirely different disease environment and an extremely toxic one. So there is a literature about this. You may have read that also in 1903, 43 kids at Cornell died of diphtheria. 43 in the span of about a month. Also, creating a huge publicity headache for the school. And it's at a time when most of the students still live in boarding houses. And so there becomes this really interesting question of kind of what the duty is on the part of the institution to keep these people safe. And Jacob Sherman, who was the president at the time, he initially releases a statement saying that your health is your responsibility.
No comment.
Like, you live in these boarding houses and some of them are filthy, but that's on you. This doesn't go over very well with some of the parents at Cornell. And ultimately what happens is, you can't make this stuff up. Andrew Carnegie sweeps in and donates a new filtration system. Obviously, typhoid is spread through the water. To Cornell, and also offers to pay the medical bills of the survivors. Now, it plays out in different ways, obviously in different institutions. At Gettysburg College, 2 years later, in 1905, there are 2 smallpox cases. The local Board of Health, this is out in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, quarantines the campus. They deputize a bunch of men to guard the dorms. Then what happens is the students swarm out of the windows and the fire escapes, trying to get out. 20 of them board a train bound for Harrisburg. And the police and a whole bunch of newspaper reporters meet them at the station in Harrisburg and take them back to Gettysburg. It's like, nope, you can't leave. And there is a kind of interesting Keystone Cops aspect to all of these stories. There's one in Chicago involving the medical school, the College of Physicians and Surgeons. A couple students are put in smallpox quarantine at a fraternity house. And a couple nights later, a police officer comes to check on some noise and roughhousing because there are complaints from the neighbors. And what the kids do is they just lower the pox flag. That's the flag that people would use to indicate a disease. And the cops just run away. I mean, they don't want to get ill. And all these colleges also had to deal with sort of the question of break and holiday. Because there's an understanding that people are going to be leaving, going to another disease environment, coming back. This is all familiar to us. So at the Michigan Agricultural College, which of course became Michigan State, they got rid of Thanksgiving a couple of years. That is not, of course, Thanksgiving. They had a break and prayer during Thanksgiving, but they got rid of the break. I mean, they didn't let people go home. I'm going to. I know that I've probably gone on long enough, and I can give you many other stories with an apology that, again, I still don't think I have kind of the big story, but I think hopefully I've given you enough illustrations of some of the smaller ones that I think we can see. The conflicts between different institutions, and also between different imaginations of what these diseases were in the first place. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll be eager to hear from the others.
Thank you.
So does anyone? Yes, yeah. David.
Jonathan, hi, it's David Oshinsky.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm fine. How are you? Jonathan, I came in a little late, so I don't know whether you talked about this. Some school systems, I think New York City may have been one of them during the great pandemic, kept the schools open in the belief that that was the one meal that students would get. In other words, they were providing social services for the kids, particularly immigrant children, that they might not receive at home. That's one question I want to ask. Could you talk about that briefly?
Oh, definitely. And again, I gave examples from really up until the Great Influenza, and there are many others afterwards. And really the story in the Great Influenza, David's absolutely right. Most school districts shut down. And I think the consensus among medical historians like Howard Markel is they did it too late. They did it after actually too many people had been infected. There were 2 exceptions to that. One of them, like David indicates, is New York. And the other is Chicago. The question of social services was at the heart of this, but not just food, David's right, also medical inspection. So I think what was different about New York and Chicago compared to many other cities is they had much more elaborate and effective systems of medical inspection. And this, too, is going to be another big theme in my story because medical inspection, we think of it as devolving upon doctors and nurses, and sometimes it did. Most often, though, it devolved upon teachers and created an enormous new set of duties and controversies for them to face. So New York and Chicago remain open, but the teachers have to inspect the kids every day, sometimes several times a day, and send them home or send them to an infirmary if the teacher determines there's something wrong with them. And I found several instances, to David's point, where the kid hasn't eaten yet, right? But he seems sick, so we can't leave him there. And the kid and his parents are saying, but he hasn't had lunch. But this is a real thing. And I should also note with respect to polio, and obviously David is the expert on this, that in the early 20th century, it's really the high schools that are more controversial than the elementary schools because, people recognize that at the high schools, you're going to have people coming from a more diverse array of communities. And obviously that raises the specter of infection in ways that, a local school that's drawing from a very small catchment doesn't.
David, if I could ask, I'm glad that David asked about about that instance, because you've spoken about the students, you've spoken about the parents, but you actually didn't tell us very much about the teachers. And of course, in this most recent experience, the teachers have had a kind of autonomy and influence and effect that they probably did not have in the 19th century when they were not organized, or even in the early 20th century when they weren't organized. So,
yes.
Please.
Well, one of my other favorite quotes I found in this research comes from Chicago in 1912 during an outbreak of several diseases, where a newspaperman refers to the teachers as sentinels in peril. They were sentinels of the disease, but they also absorbed a great disease risk themselves.
Yes.
So when you get to the Great Influenza, I'm sure some of you have read that when schools closed, as they did in most places, teachers were often deputized as nurses. And obviously there are all kinds of gender reasons for this, but it also put them at enormous risk. And there were plenty of stories of teachers who became nurses, often in schools that were reformatted as hospitals, and then died there. So the teachers are not just the monitors of health. Sometimes they're the caregivers also. I'd also like to emphasize that when there are cultural battles over these matters, which there almost always were, the teachers are often caught in the middle of them. So you think of the entire debate over vaccination, which is really as old as the United States, but takes on a different color during the great immigration waves of the late 19th and early 20th century. It's often teachers who are in the middle of that, and they're caught betwixt and between. They're threatened by health officers for not, checking if a kid was vaccinated, if they have that scar. But meanwhile, the parents are attacking them sometimes for enforcing those rules because they don't want their kids to get vaxxed. So they are caught right in the middle of it.
Jonathan, Steve Mintz here, and Americans suffer from brain damage. That is, we have memory lapses, and you're talking about one of those memory lapses, where there is this history, but nobody knows anything about it, so that everything strikes us as new. And I wonder if you could just talk about that as an issue. And had we known about the past, might it have informed the debate?
Yes, and Steve was kind enough to send me a couple of really great comments and questions after I sent him this grant that I wrote, which miraculously just got funded, so I'll be able to do more of this research. I think for me, kind of reflecting especially on my wife's experience, I think what we've forgotten is how much tension there's always been around this question. So to go back to the Great Influenza, I mean, when do you send people home? When do you close down the school or the college? Do you continue having football games even after you've closed down the college? Where do you put sick people? A lot of gyms turned into infirmaries. This happened throughout the 20th century. And most of all, and I think for me, in response to Steve's question, this is the biggest takeaway. What do you do when different authorities are telling you different things? This shouldn't be unfamiliar to us because, all of us experienced a version of this. We weren't sure whom to listen to. We were all receiving contrary advice from different quarters. I think that's one really enormous theme that runs through this whole history that we forget. And then I think perhaps the most obvious one, and I say obvious not because we've remembered it, but I think from any sentient historian would call it obvious, all of these diseases fall disproportionately on people that have less means, either less physical means or less status in their society, less authority to speak for themselves. And, one of the great tragedies is you can find in the same breath, for example, in the 19th century, people saying, African Americans don't get yellow fever. Somehow they're immune. We don't have to care for them. Or you can go to another city and you can hear people say, African Americans are spreading yellow fever. You can find this in the same American cities in the same year. Okay, but what runs through both those claims, of course, either the first one, African Americans are immune, or Africans are spreading it, is either we don't have to care about them or we can blame them. And so, obviously in a society that's riven by all kinds of inequalities, race and class and everything else, it is sadly obvious and inevitable that these diseases are going to be born in different ways by different people. I think to the point of the earlier question about that is David Ashinsky's question about schools and meals. I think the other thing that's quite obvious is that schools are going to be called upon to provide for people who are bearing this disproportionate burden. And I think that's a theme that runs through all of this.
Yes, there.
We have a question from Joanna Mischlich that we will connect you to. So
Joanna Mischlich has her hand raised.
Yeah, I can't hear it.
Let her talk.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, loud and clear.
Oh, great. Jonathan, thank you for this fascinating talk. As you may know, I'm actually speaking from London, UK, a country that has self-inflicted chaos on itself. And I have a child and with whom, 10 years old child, with whom we went through a lockdown and COVID pandemic. So I wanted to ask you, because this is fascinating, the way you have shown the differences between the attitudes of the health authorities and then educational authorities towards the pandemic's past and present. But it seems to me that in the British case, there was a total chaos. There were more exceptions to the rules. There were health authorities that didn't know when to close the schools. Some local health authorities argued for closing schools, some others didn't. The same goes for schools and the headmasters of the schools, and some rely on the educational authorities. Some were anxious because of the messages that they received from health authorities. And then there was that real situation where there were no teachers to teach because the teachers were sick. Right. And then sometimes the schools would be closed as a result of the real issue. So I wonder if there, in your cases, you have come across more chaotic, more exceptions that I have actually given you some.
Oh, definitely. I think like all historians, I was trying to make things tidier than they actually are, and I think that these events are by definition chaotic because, to use the American expression, people are flying by the seat of their pants, right? There is a history, as Steve Mintz noted, but we forget it. So we feel like, to mix metaphors, we have to reinvent the wheel, but we don't know how to do that. And so, I found instances, and this happened throughout the early and mid 20th century, where there aren't enough substitute teachers, so they actually deputize high school kids to be substitute teachers in high schools. The high school kids that aren't sick will maybe be the teacher of the other kids who aren't sick. That seems to me like an inherent formula for chaos, and I'm sure there was plenty of it. I think that one of the things that's fascinating about studying these events is, I should be clear, to go back to Steve's question, people do refer to the earlier events. So something like the Great Influenza, throughout the 20s, 30s, and 40s, when you're talking about, polio and also kind of the latter stages of diphtheria and typhoid, and then the so-called Asian flu, right after the Second World War, people do refer to the Great Influenza, but often they'll say things like, "Yeah, but that was another time." The past was a foreign country, and we can't really learn anything from it. I think the other thing we always have to remember is that often these events are also shrouded in a certain kind of shame. People are ashamed to admit that they were ill, or that they were caring for people that were ill. There's always a sense that perhaps, you were responsible for infecting somebody. And something I found really interesting in reading about disease outbreaks, really until really the Second World War, is how often newspapers would name the students that had, today we would say, test positive. Yeah. You're talking about some female academy, and it's like Miss Edith Jones got smallpox and had to go back to her home in Georgia. Yeah. So, you read that, and I think it makes a certain kind of sense why people would be rather loath to talk about this and would be more inclined to sweep it under the table. And, to borrow Joanna's language, I think that too, in a very real way, is a formula for chaos, right? Because when we're not communicating with each other, things get even more chaotic because we're not getting and transmitting information.
There is a question that we're getting on the internet there about the interaction between health and education institutions at the college level, where the politicians weren't so keen on relating to as in secondary and primary education, whether there is a difference there at the college level between those two authorities.
Yeah, I think there's an enormous difference. I think that obviously those differences are going to be sharper if you compare a private school like Gettysburg or Cornell, to take my examples, to say Penn State or the University of Illinois, which also had like very big disease outbreaks throughout the 20th century. But I think the point here is that public authorities did become involved, but they came involved in a different way. If you're talking about the big flagship schools like Penn State and Illinois, one way they became involved was by demanding that the universities devise different precautions, but also, I think this is really important, different physical plans. So if you think about the rise of dormitories in the 20th century, and the Cornell story obviously is part of this, you have to think about disease, because dormitories provided a way for the universities to exert a kind of in loco parentis, as we call it in the United States, that they couldn't when these students were off campus. And if any of you are familiar with the work of Helen Horowitz, who wrote about women's colleges, she put a big emphasis on dormitories because, again, there was this concern that women were off in these boarding houses and we don't know what they're doing and we want to, govern their morals and all that. And that's all real. But I think the disease part is real too. Now, there's a sad irony in this, and this also would percolate through the political realm. Once you get them into dorms, you're also making a new disease environment, right? And sometimes a more toxic one, right? You think they're going to be under your thumb in an in loco parentis kind of way, but kids have their own way, if you haven't noticed, of evading some of those rules. So to take the point of the question, obviously it's different in higher ed because people are older, they're citizens, in some cases they're voters. There's also a private-public difference, but I do think it becomes politicized, obviously, with the public institutions, especially around the question of the physical plan. And let's remember, that's always the thing that people can see, right? I mean, the bricks and mortar is really important politically, because that's something that's visible to the eye. A lot of things in education aren't. A new dorm is.
One more question for you, Jonathan, and that's about the takeaways. Now, two takeaways from your talk are
Yes. Steve,
are
could you speak
obvious.
a little bit more loudly? Sorry.
Okay, two takeaways from your talk strike me as really clear. There's nothing new under the sun, and the same issues arise every time. And then there's a third, and is that third takeaway that in the past we overreacted, or is it that we underreacted?
It's a great question, I think, and I know this is going to sound wishy-washy, but it's the way I read it. I think we did both of those things. I think David Oshinsky would tell you that at different times in the polio epidemic, we overreacted. That part of the polio epidemic was an epidemic of fear. But then there were other times where we absolutely underreacted. You get closer to the present. You think about the measles outbreaks that started in California in the late 70s, and they passed these immunization laws in places like California, and they don't fund them, like it's an unfunded mandate. There's so much more to say here. I didn't get to this part, but I found incredible stuff about measles in the 70s, where, I find school superintendents saying, look, what you're now doing is you're making us into health officers without money or power. You're saying, okay, you've got to enforce these vaccination laws, but you're not giving us any money to do that. And you're not even putting any teeth in the law that will allow us to penalize somebody that doesn't follow along. So, I think at different times there was a radical underestimation, sometimes because, again, people were afraid, sometimes because they were ignorant. Sometimes there was an overestimation when, rumors, especially those inflected by race and gender, kind of take over, media and people's minds. But to the nothing new under the sun, Steve, I think I would add one thing that is new under the sun, which is pretty obvious, which is just the rapidity with which both information and misinformation can spread. That's clearly new. There is an enormous difference. Even as early as like the H1N1 thing in like 2009, 2010. Obviously, people aren't online then like they are now, and social media didn't really exist, not quite. Nevertheless, I think that it's so much easier, even at that time, and clearly now, to press a button and get thousands, 10,000s, hundreds of thousands, millions of people to see what you have to say, whether it's grounded in anything like knowledge or actual information or not. And that does represent something that's new. I think it's different in both degree and in kind.
Thank you very much.
Can I just ask one more question to really put you on the spot, Jonathan? Can you hear me okay?
No, it's still a little bit dim.
Okay, I'll talk as loud as you. Oh.
Yeah, better.
Better?
Yeah, much better.
Good. Okay. So, Jonathan, we were talking this morning, you brought up measles. We were talking about measles. So, as you know, California did put teeth in the law with S-277, in other words, mandating no more religious exemptions, no more philosophical exemptions, etc. 2 years later, the same legislator, Richard Pan, with Governor Newsom's assent, tried to put the COVID vaccine for children on the mandated list, and they got their hat handed to them. Was that an overreach?
Well, I mean, look, it's a great question. And, seems to me, having watched Susan, having watched my wife kind of deal with this question, over and over and over again, I don't think she would say that you could make a strong scientific argument about why it would be legitimate medically and every other way to require a measles vaccine, but not a COVID vaccine. Maybe somebody's made that argument, but I don't think this was really about science or medicine. I think it was about the way these different diseases got coded politically in our political and media spheres. And again, I think that goes back to what I do think is new about this moment. It may well be that if there had been Facebook, earlier, that the measles vaccine also would never have taken root because it would have been so much easier to organize against it. Part of this story, of course, is the story of vaccination, especially anti-vaccination. And David and others will tell you that we've had anti-vaccination campaigns for as long as we've had vaccination. But, it was a lot harder to recruit for those campaigns when you were leafleting and going door to door than when you had a website called like Americans for Medical Freedom or, Americans for Scientific Vaccine Information. That's just a different ball of wax.
Thank you very much. And I will actually say that from my point of view, I do have another thing that I bring with me home, which is also, and this is not a question, this is a statement. Basically, because I think what you talked on, and which I would like to discuss more, is actually that educational institutions are so tremendously more than educational institutions. They are institutions of health and welfare and stuff like that, and that may be actually what actually defines their role in society. And sometimes we make a big mistake when we spend too much time talking about education and the content, because they are welfare institutions. And if I could give you a lot of questions from examples from the 17th and 18th century Swedish environment, in urban environments, where the schools really turned into places where orphan children or parentless children really were supported with food, water, health, care, clothing, etc., in a situation where the rest of the institutions of the state could not function the same way. So I think it puts a light on that part of it. But it's not a question, because now I'm going to leave the word to Lorna. And thank you, Lorna. To go on, take in.
Sure.
Thank you, Jonathan, very much.
Well, thank you. First, it's important for me to say that I'm an educator. I'm not a historian. And my work is to address the racial and ethnic disproportion with engagement with the juvenile justice system. And in doing that kind of work, it is important to be rooted in history. So I do look at my work through the lens of history, through the lens of trauma. There is a connection between juvenile justice involvement and trauma and grief. And so I think I'll talk about that today, along with a recent experience that I was able to have as part of my grant-funded work. I was able to bring a team of educators to Uvalde, Texas, which experienced a horrific trauma. And on May 24th, there was a school shooting where 19 fourth grade children were killed along with their 2 teachers. And the shooter, who was also a student of that school district and was not on track to graduate, had just turned 18. He was the shooter, and he also was killed in the process. So I know this section of today's convening and tomorrow's is about trauma, and so I'm here to speak about that. So in terms of reducing or addressing racial and ethnic disproportion and engagement with the juvenile justice system, in Texas has been paying attention to the adverse childhood experiences that kids engaging in juvenile justice have self-reported. You may be familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, which is also known as ACEs. It came out in the 1990s. Felitti and Anda, who were medical doctors, were doing research. Actually, they were doing work with folks who were engaging with an obesity lab. They were overweight and they needed to lose weight in order to ensure that they could live longer. And so in that work, the doctors found many of the folks were losing weight, 20, 30, 50, 70 pounds, and thus increasing their lifespan. But some of them regained that weight in a short amount of time. And so that was quite puzzling for the doctors. And they started asking more questions and more questions. And they found that the people who were gaining back the weight was a protective factor for them because they had experienced adverse childhood experiences. And so in this work that they did, they identified 10 adverse childhood experiences that were all inside the home. Abuse, that's physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. Neglect, that's physical and emotional neglect. Mental illness in the home, an incarcerated family member in the home, or incarcerated that was in the home. A mother who was treated violently, substance abuse, or parents apart, including divorce or parents who were not ever married. And so Texas Juvenile Justice Department has been paying attention to that, and they have been asking kids who have been coming into the juvenile justice system about their childhood experiences. And these children are still children. And this is self-reported, so we can assume that these numbers are lower than what they actually are. And so, first of all, a person who experiences 4 or more ACEs, their chances of early death are greatly increased. For kids in Texas, juvenile justice system, 80% of the kids who are locked up have experienced 4 or more ACEs, self-reported, as compared to 12.5% of the general public. Yes. My work is funded by the U.S. Department of Justice to bring trauma-informed training and restorative practices training to teachers, administrators in schools, as well as law enforcement and the judicial system. We started our work in Williamson County. In Williamson County, 55% of the kids who end up in juvenile justice were referred directly from schools. And so the work in schools is important. And this work to train teachers and administrators about trauma and about creating environments that can accommodate kids who've experienced trauma and to not further traumatize them in the school environment. That's the kind of work that we do. We were awarded additional funding from the U.S. Department of Justice to replicate our model that is started in Williamson County to 8 additional counties in Texas. And that's when I got the call to start connecting in Uvalde, Texas. And so I was able to bring a team of folks, restorative practitioners, educators to Uvalde, and we held listening circles. We had the honor of holding a circle with a family who had lost their daughter. We also had the honor of holding circles and listening to folks who work with kids, particularly counselors. And so what I'm here to say is in supporting our children who have experienced trauma, we need to support the adults who support them, because we saw a lot of secondary trauma among the folks who were supporting the kids. We heard stories from counselors who were having nightmares, who couldn't sleep and couldn't go forward with their regular self-care because they were lacking sleep. And just the process of us listening to them was, and we're not therapists, but listening to them was helpful to them, and we could visibly see difference in how they arrived and how they left. There was laughter, there were hugs when we left. And that's not just for the community in Uvalde, it's for all teachers and administrators, because as you noted, schools are becoming places, and maybe they always have been places, that are more than just education. And so by us providing this training, first of all, we can be preventative, knowing that some kids are coming from homes that are really difficult. We don't have to ask them, we don't have to ask every kid, what is your ACE score? We can just know that if we create an environment in schools that is safe and supportive, where kids can be connected authentically to two adults, where they are not bullied, then that in itself will help to reduce the impact of those ACEs, and it can help reduce the numbers of kids who end up in juvenile justice. I said my work is tied to history because when I look at the racial and ethnic disproportion in engagement with the juvenile justice system, I can't not think about the war on drugs in the 1990s. In education, it's called the school to prison pipeline. And it still exists today. The 55% of kids in juvenile justice in Williamson County are coming directly from schools. But when you look at the war on drugs in the 1990s, that didn't answer the question for me. That was actually my dissertation research. And so I went further back and further back to the start of the country to look at how our schools and how our prisons connected. And my lens is policy also. And so it's important to acknowledge that 77% of the history of this country, starting in 1776, was under laws that said that either slavery or segregation and discrimination were legal. It became illegal through the Civil Rights Act officially, but it didn't mean that segregation and discrimination ended right when that law was passed. Also in Uvalde, we got to talk with community leaders, and they talked about the shooting, but a number of the community leaders, because it's about 90% Hispanic, the community is, a number of them talked about how when they went to school, their Latino name was anglicized, and that was a pain that they still carried. And I shared this story with a friend of mine who's retired from another part of Texas, Latino also, and he became emotional because the same thing happened to him. So those are emotional traumas that people have endured. One of the questions for this conference is about diversity. When I think about diversity and I think about trauma, I think about historical trauma, and I think about intergenerational trauma. A powerful example of historical trauma is the genocide that Native Americans have experienced on this land. There is research, there's new scales on measuring how trauma impacts folks, particularly the Native population. There's a historical losses scale and a historical losses associated symptom scale by Dr. Whitbeck and colleagues. And they found, I mean, we know this is not surprising, but sometimes when you have things in data form and statistical form, they're paid attention to a little bit more deeply. But even today, the Native population experiences sadness, depression, anger, anxiety, fear, shame, loss of sleep, loss of concentration. So when I think about that through the lens of schooling, and I think about the 80+% of kids who have experienced adverse childhood experiences at home, and they're sitting locked up in jails, there's a connection, and we can do something about it, right? They're responding appropriately. Sadness, depression, anger, anxiety, that's an appropriate response to having experienced trauma. Fear, loss of sleep, concentration. But when we have teachers who are also stressed out and who don't have tools, and the main tool is to send the kid to in-school suspension or to send them to out-of-school suspension or to expel them from school. Those are the tools that are typically used. And that's how I believe we end up with the population in juvenile justice that is so highly traumatized. Also, there's new research on grief and juvenile justice. More than 70% of juvenile justice-involved youth in a particular study by Lansing in 2018, more than 70% of them were grieving 2 or more deaths. And the majority of those deaths were violent deaths. And so again, these kids are responding appropriately to what they're experiencing, but we're not responding appropriately to what they're experiencing. And so that's the work that I do. We bring trauma-informed training, again, to school, districts, law enforcement, and the judicial system. Trauma-informed training teaches about what trauma is, how it impacts people, and what you can do differently behaviorally, how you can create school environments that are safe and supportive. And what you can do in the moment when a child is dysregulated to regulate them rather than to escalate the situation. Because if there's 2 people yelling and one's an adult and one's a kid, the adult is always going to win, right? We also provide restorative practices training. Restorative practices are practices that were gifted to the education community by Native people who in Australia, they were sending their kids to school. The kids were getting in trouble, as kids do. The way that the schools were disciplining the kids were more damaging to those kids. And so in Australia, the Native people said, we're not saying don't discipline our kids, we're just asking you to try the way that we deal with discipline. And so restorative practices are a way to, one, build community preventatively, but when harm is caused, is a way to convene conversations, to convene people who may be at odds and to help move them through a healing process of that harm and holding the person accountable who caused harm. Some people like to say, oh, that's woo-woo, that's kumbaya, that's too easy on the kid. I think it's harder. I think it's harder to have to sit there and listen to the harmful impact of your behavior. That's what restorative practices and restorative justice does. And so that's the training that we're bringing to, again, school districts, law enforcement, and the judicial system. I'm thankful to the Department of Justice who believes in our work. We started in one county, and they funded that, and they funded us more than $7 million to continue this work in additional counties in Texas. So I think I'll stop with that.
Thank you very much. Wonderful.
Since you're interested in history, I want, and Jonathan is a witness to this, schools have, as Banks said, schools have always done more than teach. On the other hand, in the early 20th century, we had large numbers of immigrants who came from varied backgrounds, we had a variety of institutions that actually took care of them, in addition to schools. There were social settlements, there were mental health clinics, there were a variety of social and community-based institutions. What it sounds like to me is that you're beginning to do a lot of that again, bringing to children from these communities the kinds of services that had been brought in the early 20th century. I guess my question is why the schools have to always become the node through which all of this is extended. Why can't we create alternative institutions? I mean, mental health institutions, for example, or social settlements, or the equivalents of social work as a result of the social settlements in a lot of ways.
That's a really good question. I think schools are a great catch-all because all kids have to go to school. And there are schools conveniently located in neighborhoods, so transportation is provided if needed. And so I think because of that, schools have become that place in some places. And usually it's not a centralized effort. It has to do with the availability of nonprofit organizations in the area. and which nonprofits are in the area. So some places like Austin, where there are a lot of nonprofits, there are more services available to children in schools because there happens to be a lot of nonprofits. But in rural areas, not a whole lot of services. And you kind of are just, for the kids living in those communities, you just get what you get. So yeah, I think a more concerted effort and a developmental approach to understanding what kids need and ensuring that they have those resources, whether or not they're in areas that happen to have nonprofits or not, would be beneficial.
I think it's interesting with the historical perspective on that, with the schools as being kind of to solve all problems that is kind of existence, and you kind of load into things. But I think it's important also to see in the long run that actually when institutions like schools kind of was established, they were actually responding to issues like basic social welfare needs of societies. Children needed to eat, and they couldn't get food somewhere else, so schools provided that. So actually it's not only that we load new things into it, it's actually they came from that situation where they were loaded with other meanings. But then in terms of all these other institutions that existed, I think it's I looked into that a little bit, because when in the Northern Europe, when we transformed the educational system to a democratic institution, which was modeled after the American high school type, as a high school in which all children went, because we had the advantage from that point of view that we had different institutions for different social classes and different genders, and we had a lot of different institutions for all these different needs and different kind of situations. Halfway homes, afternoon homes, whatever. There was all these kind of institutions, but in a striving to create equality and not sorting children out into separate institutions and thereby stigmatizing them. You said, well, they all have to go to the same institutions. They should all go to the same school and be treated the same way. But then, as an effect of that, you had an institution which emphasizes sameness, but sameness is not the same for the kids, because they live under different circumstances. So then there is a kind of a circular movement again. Then you do this kind of thing. You establish those links between that institution and those that you cannot fit in, won't model according to the rules. So I think it's a kind of a back and forth situation there, and where the ambition to do something equal for each actually does not work, because it's not equal in any other senses.
And I think that's the conversation around the distinction between equal and equitable.
Exactly.
Considering the history of the country and how African Americans in particular were enslaved for hundreds of years, and the impact of that historical trauma and intergenerational trauma we still see today in terms of maternal health and birth outcomes for African American women, regardless of their social status or income level. So it's important to make that distinction between equal and equitable.
I can't imagine, how hard it is to deal with the issues that you're dealing with in Uvalde, which is just going on and on and on as more information becomes available, and it's heartbreaking and unbelievable what has happened. And so when you go in, how do you help people go on with their lives? How do you help them be resilient in the face of suffering that really is unimaginable to all of us? And obviously, this will never go away for those parents or classmates, but what kinds of help are you able to provide to people who have suffered the most intense trauma that's really imaginable for most of us?
Right. Well, first of all, myself and my team that I brought, we went for 6 weeks. We left Thursday mornings from the Austin area, and stayed overnight and came back on Fridays. We were experiencing secondary trauma, and we got to leave, and we were only there 2 days a week. So we made sure, so part of the Step Up Texas team, Step Up Texas is the name of my grant-funded project. Part of the team is trauma-informed practitioners and trainers. And so we practiced what we preached, and we learned more about secondary trauma and self-care with secondary trauma. And so we provide those workshops to folks in Uvalde, knowing that they don't have the benefit of leaving, knowing that, you know, it's such a small community that we would hear people say, you either were related to somebody who died or you knew somebody. And most people knew at least two or more. And so it's a long haul, and I don't have that answer. But we are providing trauma-informed training. And the grant allows, the funding structure for the grant is that we will be able to provide the salary and benefits for 2 people for 2 years that we will support with trauma-informed training and restorative practices training, so that they can provide the services and also train other folks. But it affects the whole community. And what I learned quickly too, what we learned was that the harm wasn't isolated to May 24th, 2022. There was harm that has been happening for years in terms of racial segregation. And again, like I said, how kids were treated in the schools historically. There was a walkout in the 1970s that happened in protest of a Latino teacher not being, his contract not being renewed. And even on the day that we were meeting with one of the families, someone had posted on social media, there was a fan page for the shooter, actually, and someone had posted upsetting content on that page. And so the harm continues. And so we're there to offer what we can offer, but we're learning as well. And trying to share the word so that other folks who may be able to help will continue to support, because the incident may have happened, 5 months ago, but the pain and the grief is going to be happening for a long time. And when I think about the shooter too, his profile, it's the typical shooter of many profiles, bullied, difficult home life. It's the same profile of the kids who end up in juvenile justice. Thank you for that question.
Heart goes out to you.
We do not. So maybe this is a good time. Those questions may come later. So this is maybe a good time to have coffee, 5-minute break. Thank you very much.
I'm a sociologist. I rarely study children, although this particular book was an exception. I don't consider myself to be an expert in trauma, although this book certainly was about trauma. But I thought in the end, it must be so I could see Jonathan again after 40 years. Must be. Well, that's a good. And we haven't changed a bit, either one of us, have we? Anyway, thank you very much. The other possible reason why I might have been invited is that I was the chancellor of the Boston campus of the University of Massachusetts, which was the first place, as far as I know, in the US to receive an official COVID case. because we had a student who arrived from Wuhan the day after the Wuhan airport shut down. And I was in charge of running a campus which now had to cope with the potential of a deadly pandemic arriving when nobody thought it was anywhere near the United States yet. So, Jonathan, I can be an informant for you because I had extensive experience with the public health authorities and juggling all kinds of questions about legitimacy, authority, who was responsible, who could decide to do what. So call me later and I'll be happy to help you. But I guess the reason why I'm here is because of this book, which is, Rampage, Social Roots of School Shootings. Let me say a little bit first about the people who were involved in this work, because they were an extraordinary collection of graduate students who were working with me at Harvard at the time, and who dropped everything they were working on to work on this project. None of us had had any connection whatsoever to this topic before. It came up because the National Research Council responded to the National Academy of Sciences, which in turn was responding to a congressional act that mandated this study. And we began the work in 2000, and the book was published in 2004. So it's nearly 20 years old now. But it was the first, I think, real serious study of rampage school shootings. And I think it came to a lot of very counterintuitive conclusions, which is my favorite kind of social science. But I do want to mention Sibel Fox and David Harding, who are now full professors at UC Berkeley in sociology, Joel Almeida, who is at Harvard Graduate School of Education, and Wendy Roth, who's one of your colleagues, Jonathan, at Penn in sociology. They were all graduate students at the time, and they formed this extraordinary research group with me and spent 3 months each in Heath, Kentucky, and Westside, Arkansas, two places that had seen horrible rampage shootings about 3 years before we arrived. And the reason why we chose these places was that at the time, there was kind of a, wouldn't call it theory, but speculation that rampage shootings had begun in the South and that they were somehow peculiar to the South. Thereafter, of course, they exploded everywhere all across the country, but actually not in random places. So the first thing that intrigued us about rampage shootings was that they tended to occur, and this is still true, they tended to occur in very small towns, very far away from urban centers that were known to be sites of violence. So nobody is surprised when there are shootings in cities like New York City, where I am now. But oddly enough, this kind of shooting, rampage shootings in schools, did not happen in cities. It didn't happen in cities like New York. It still doesn't generally happen in cities like New York. It happened in small, isolated towns, a large distance from anywhere. In fact, places that most Americans have never heard of. And they end up on the map for all these horrible, wrong reasons. And so we were very intrigued. What is it about small town America, which is known or thought to be the best place in the world to raise your children? And we were constantly told, this is the best place in the world to raise your children. How could these terrible, terrible things be happening in places like that? And what we found, to sort of summarize in a very pithy way what was a very rich study, I think, was that to be a marginal boy, and it is nearly always boys, about 99% of the time it's boys, to be a socially marginal boy in a very stable community, like nobody goes anywhere, is to experience a particular kind of social tension and friction that produces all of the ingredients, all of the sociological ingredients that can lead, don't always, of course, but can lead to these kinds of terrible, terrible traumas. So what is it about being in a place where everybody knows your name, nobody locks the door, people have been there for multiple generations, you're going to the same high school your grandparents went to? Why is our places so rich in social capital such terrible places to be a marginal boy? And the answer is that you feel, or they felt, these shooters who we studied in great detail, that they were trapped forever in a kind of social hell that was never, ever going to change, because nothing changed in these towns. Everybody else was happy, you were miserable, and it wasn't going to change. because you are going to the same school as your grandparents went to, because everybody stays there, and the social tensions that develop as a result just circulate around and around and around and never leave you alone. So the book is made up of many different, I think, very, to me, sociologically intriguing questions. One of the questions is, why don't kids tell? We learned a lot about who knows what's coming. And it just simply isn't the case, as is often reported in the media, that these are spontaneous explosions. They are never spontaneous. They are often planned in great detail. We found data suggesting that they had been planned as long as 9 months in advance of the actual shootings. And they're not particularly secrets either. They're secrets from the adults, but they're not secrets among children. And this is one of the most traumatic aspects, is that the children who had an inkling of what was coming and didn't tell anyone experience a monumental source of grief and guilt that they didn't come forward. But one of the reasons we wanted to understand was, why don't they come forward when there's so much information circulating? We found cases, and we studied every single case of rampage shootings in the United States from 1970 until 2000. And we found cases in which the night before the shooting, the shooter called 15 people and intimated what he was going to do. Never in so much detail that it was absolutely certain, but enough to scare kids enough that they didn't come to school the next day. Right? So they were scared enough not to go to school, but they didn't tell any adults, not a single adult who could have been positioned to do something. Why not? Well, this goes back to the experience of adolescence, and I think the psychiatrists and psychologists in the group today will understand this better probably than any of the rest of us. What is adolescence about? It is about surrounding yourself with a kind of demilitarized zone of disengagement with adults in order to prove a degree of autonomy, which is just beginning to develop in early adolescence. And so if you come forward to adults with information like this, you are treading into a domain in which you will be regarded as a turncoat, a crybaby, a teacher's pet. There's all kinds of social damage that you will experience if you come forward. Now, you might come forward anyway if you're absolutely certain of the information that you've heard. But it is in the nature, sadly, of the communications that school shooters engage in, that they're never absolutely blunt. They're veiled. So the shooters in our book said things like, "You'll see who lives or dies on Monday," or "I won't be around because I'll be running from the cops," or a whole string of statements of this kind. And when the source is someone who is known to be attention-seeking, this is not the first act, this is the last act in a long, long series of acts intended to try and gain attention and gain social acceptance. A person like that, who then starts letting out these threats in this veiled form, doesn't appear to be a totally reliable source. So for a kid to come forward into that demilitarized zone and risk their own social reputation for information that is highly suspect, but scary enough not to come to school, is a real dilemma. And it's the dilemma that we point to in the end as a matter of social policy, that there need to be easier ways for kids to come forward, less compromising, more private ways for them to come forward, because they do have information. In every single one of these cases, we found a trail behind it of people who knew something was coming, but almost never stepped forward. And that is the greatest tragedy of all. We also looked at schools as organizations. So this is not a psychological study. In fact, it's very deliberately a sociological study. It's an attempt to look at organizations and how information flows in them, and to try to understand why, with so much information circulating, was no one able to put the picture together. So what we found was that, very much like the work that was done, brilliant work that was done by colleagues at Columbia, that you may remember, Jonathan, about the Challenger space disaster. So the Challenger space disaster was a very interesting case of a terrible accident that was foretold in many ways. I mean, the engineers knew that O-rings would freeze up if it was too cold. There was a lot of information circulating that this looked a little bit risky, but that never got to that information never got to the people who could have made a decision to halt the Challenger space disaster. The same thing was true in these schools. So Michael Carneal, one of the protagonists in the Heath, Kentucky shooting, who was recently came up for parole, which was denied, I think just 3 weeks ago. He's 45 years old now, but he was 13 at the time of the shooting. Michael Carneal had been caught stomping on fish that he pulled out of a fish tank, looking at racy pornography on the school library computers. There were a whole series of incidents that marked Michael as being in distress, but they were observed by different teachers in different places, none of whom ever were brought together to assemble a single picture. And that's partly because we set teachers up, those of you who know schools very well, as sort of kings of their own castle. We don't really subject them to requirements to share information. In fact, we subject them to the opposite. They're expected to maintain a degree of privacy. We believe in second chances. The whole society believes in second chances. So the kind of disciplinary record, if you want to call it that, was pretty minor stuff, but nonetheless, a little disturbing. Building up in the 8th grade didn't transmit over to the high school when Michael Carneal started high school. Those organizational boundaries between junior high and high school, they don't travel. The information, the records don't travel, and they don't travel for a good reason. We don't really want teachers to expect the worst from a kid who's had a traumatic 8th grade. They need to start all over again. We all start all over again all the time. But as a consequence, there is information loss all the way along that chain. Nobody spots the patterns. And that was true of almost all of the shootings that we looked at. There's also the question of what we call the dark side of social capital. So in these very small towns where everyone knows everyone, and there's a really strong bonds between generations, very strong bonds between, supporters of the high school football team and the community at large, which comes to celebrate the achievements of athletes, but doesn't celebrate the achievements of squares who are interested in, calculus. There's a very strong prohibition against bringing forth trouble, pointing to trouble. So Andrew Golden, who was 11 years old at the time of the shooting in West Side, Arkansas, was known by families in the neighborhood for torturing cats in the backyard. It was known that he was doing this. It was known that he made scary kinds of threats. Psychiatric school nurses in the neighborhood drove their children to school rather than put them on the bus with Andrew Golden. But none of them ever came forward and said to Andrew Golden's parents, I think your son is disturbed. Tremendous prohibitions, especially in small, social capital rich communities, against breaking relationships by breaking bad news. So there were lots of people who were a little afraid of the shooters, but they never came forward with this information in any form that would have been able to trap it and direct therapeutic resources to those boys. Never. And again, there's just a strong sense in communities that are high on social capital, which is what these small towns tended to be like, against sharing observations of troubled kids. When we asked parents during our research, would you come forward if you saw a kid doing something that was dangerous? They all said, absolutely, that, we take care of each other. That's why we're here. We would. And 10 minutes later, they would say, but if somebody came forward and said my kid was behaving badly, I would what's your motive? Why are you doing this? Tremendous prohibitions against pointing to troubled children. And as a result, it's almost like a community, I wouldn't call it amnesia exactly, but it's a community almost deliberately sidelining information that might have been a signal something was truly, truly frightening. I want to come back to some of the things that Lorna talked about, because she arrived in Uvalde so soon after these tragedies. I am sorry to say that what we found years later, so we were arriving 3 years after these tragedies, was that the communities were completely splintered and destroyed. there was, in the immediate aftermath of these shootings, there was almost exactly the opposite, a tremendous sense of solidarity. People likened the experience to having come through the Second World War. This tremendous sense the entire community was victimized and they were all going to hold together, often against the outside world. And I'm sorry to say, even against agencies like Lorna's, like, leave us alone, don't come near us. This is our tragedy, let us just deal with it. 3 years later, however, all that solidarity was gone. Lots of shattering questions. Who really owns this tragedy? And this is, I heard some of you talking in the break a little bit about this. Is it the people who lost their children? Is it the teachers who were in the school at the same time? Is it the people who were alive at the same time in the community? Is it the rest of us who were around when 9/11 happened and all felt traumatized? Who owns this tragedy? And it often came down to some pretty stressful and somewhat ugly questions. Who owns the money coming into this community when money starts to pour in as people around the country try to do what they can to be generous and helpful? Who owns that money? This happened a lot in Heath and West Side because these were two very small communities a long way from any cities. But for example, Paducah, Kentucky got some federal grants to improve on school safety. But people in Heath said, Paducah? We're not in Paducah. We're 20 miles from Paducah. The rest of the country may think we're in Paducah, but we know we're in Heath, and Heath is a tiny, tiny community. So why is Paducah trying to take resources that belong to Heath? These really divisive questions began to broil and were everywhere when we arrived. Memorials. Today, apparently, I learned when Michael Carneal came up for parole a couple of weeks ago that there is actually a memorial to the 5 people who died in that shooting. But when we arrived 3 years after the shooting, there were no memorials. There were plaques that people didn't want displayed. The sheriff's department couldn't find a place to put a memorial because people wanted to move on. Well, not everybody wanted to move on. The families who lost their children will never move on. And they did want to see memorials. But everyone else around them would say, this is a school, not a cemetery. We can't focus our attention on what happened to you and your family 3 years ago. We need to be able to move on for the sake of the kids that we're supposed to be teaching now. So what we found was these concentric circles of experience of this trauma. People were affected very differently depending on which circle they were in. The extent to which they wanted to remember, needed to come to grips with the experience or get past it, depended a lot on where they were in those circles. And it was not an easy, not a healthy experience at all. In fact, a lot of what we report on here shatters a lot of expectations that we held as well about communities in America and the ways in which they cope with grief. They don't cope very well. None of us do, really. So post-trauma, teachers flooded out of teaching, left those schools and never came back. They were just as traumatized, if not worse, than the children. They were expected to be mental health experts when they had no training to be mental health experts. They were expected to be there to put everything back together again, and they weren't put back together again. I have to say, as a society, what I learned from this is that we're not very well organized at all to cope with these tragedies. And we're still not. We don't know how to trap the information that's coming, and we often don't realize until quite a little bit later that it's there. In the Sandy Hook shooting, for example, there were people who were concerned about that guy for quite a long time, but nobody figured out how to trap the information and do anything with it to potentially prevent that horrible absolute tragedy. So I think what we learned from this study is that the most effective thing we can do to prevent these traumas is to provide kids in particular with ways of coming forward with the information they have that will not subject them to that demilitarized zone between adolescents and adults, that will be kept very private, but will be acted on. Because one of the things we learned from them was how deeply cynical they are about what adults do with information that's troubling. They would tell us they don't want to hear this from us, they won't act on it. They'll tell us to go solve our own problems. And that is very often what they would hear from adults in the schools when they brought forward the kind of troubling information they had, not about shooting, but about stress and conflict and breakdowns of relationships. They would be told, you need to go learn how to solve problems. You're growing up. And they don't believe adults are there to intervene. And that's another reason why they tended not to come forward. But we do need to give them ways to do that. And what we found was that the most effective way was for school resource officers who are not part of the school disciplinary structure, because kids are very worried about false positives, very worried if they come forward with information that turns out to be nothing, which is 99% of the time what will be the case. It will be nothing. It's the 1% of the time that it's something that we really want them to be able to come forward. They're more comfortable coming forward to disciplinary structures that are not part of the school because they don't worry as much about their acquaintances being expelled. And school resource officers who are part of the criminal justice system at the very, very weakest end of it inspired more trust in them. They thought they would do something about it, but they wouldn't spread it around if it turned out to be one of those false positives. And so we advocated pretty strongly in this book for more resources of that kind to be available to schools so that the best source of information about a trauma that hasn't yet happened but might can come forward. I'm very happy to answer any questions that you might have about this study. It is now almost like a vintage or classic, but I'm sorry to say that most of the shootings I read about fall into the same pattern. The big difference with Uvalde, the main difference with two main differences, I think, with Uvalde is one that it's a Hispanic community. The vast majority of these rampage school shootings happen in white communities. They don't happen in Black neighborhoods, and they don't generally happen in Hispanic neighborhoods either. So this was sad and unusual. And the second thing that was unusual about it is how long it went on. Most of these school shootings are over in a matter of seconds, which is why the criminal justice reflex is so pointless. It's over before the cops can get there, almost all the time. This was unusual in that it just went on for such a long time, and clearly there could have been a much more effective police response by far. But most of the time, that's not the case. It's just over. It's over in seconds, long before law enforcement can get there, which is why trying to trap information in advance is so important. And it's more important than building fences around schools because much of the time, not all of the time, but much of the time, the shooter is part of the internal school community and wouldn't be trapped by a fence.
Thank you very much. Fabulous. I'm sure that there's a lot of questions about this, but I do think, given the fact that we are running short of time, I think we'll leave the word to Amanda Littauer, and then we'll save the questions for afterwards and take it all at the same time. I'm sorry about that, but we need to do
fine.
that. For
Whatever you like to do.
Yeah. Okay, Amanda.
Thank you. And thanks for the ongoing conversation and the invitation. It's been a really thought-provoking day so far. So I'm an associate professor of history and gender studies, but I also have the interesting perspective today of being a student in a counseling master's program. So I'm especially enjoying the kind of interdisciplinary approach today, and it's really got me thinking. I'm focusing more on LGBTQ youth today, which is a subpopulation, clearly, but it's really striking to me how many of the themes that we've been discussing are relevant. So, for example, Steve opened this morning by noting some features of children's experience of the pandemic. So learning loss and educational disruption, foreboding about the future, isolation, mental health struggles. And Josh Sisler discussed allostatic load and neurobiological responses to chronic stress that dispose youth to long-term effects related to trauma and complex PTSD. So part of what I think I'm suggesting today is that same-sex desiring and gender nonconforming youth have been having precisely these experiences for many decades. So I'll come back to that, but let me jump for the moment to a little anecdote about earlier this semester. I had a student, I'm teaching LGBT history this semester, and a student in a journal wrote, I left NIU, that's Northern Illinois University where I teach, 20 years ago after I returned to DeKalb after a weekend at home to find that someone had painted homophobic threats directly at me on the walls of my townhouse. I withdrew the following day. I never reported it to anyone because I was terrified. Then when I returned home, I found out I was no longer welcome because of dropping out of school and because I was dating a woman. I've been in therapy to overcome some of these issues and have rebuilt my family relationships. One of my hopes in finishing this class is to feel more secure with my identity at the end of the semester. I'm interested in pursuing a career in forensic psychology, and my area of interest is adults who have experienced multiple traumas. So now in her early 40s, this woman experienced a traumatic event that changed the course of her life, contributing directly to prolonged educational disruption, housing dislocation, familial rejection, and insecurity about her own sexual identity that she's still working to heal. While there are, of course, many ways of situating and defining trauma, I'm understanding it through a kind of counseling lens as an experience or a series of experiences that were unwanted and overwhelming to the point that the brain struggles to integrate the experience into working memory, causing lasting and recurring feelings of distress, unsafety, and intense fear or anxiety. For my student, the combination of the homophobic threats and the rejection by her family eradicated her sense of belonging and undermined not only her sense of safety, but her capacity to develop an integrated sense of self as a queer woman. She's taking my class this fall not only because of the subject matter, but also because I'm teaching it online, so she doesn't have to return to the physical campus to take it. So even as she works to continue healing this trauma and achieve what we might think of as post-traumatic growth, she continues to manage trauma's lasting and recurring effects. And part of what makes this sort of trauma so challenging to resolve is that American society is not necessarily in a better place with regard to LGBTQ youth support than we were 20 years ago. We're in an intense historical moment in which, on the one hand, LGBTQ young people continue to expand their social and cultural footprint. A Gallup poll earlier this year, for example, found that a full 21% of Gen Z now identifies as LGBTQ. Queer and trans youth and young adults are creating vast quantities of cultural content, which is more diverse than ever, including non-binary and trans experience, intersex and ace or asexual embodiments, and ever-proliferating labels and cultural categories. At the same time, as we're all too aware in this Texas location, we are in the midst of a powerful political backlash against the foundations of civil rights, privacy, and bodily autonomy. And these assaults disproportionately target and affect young people. These include the right to access reproductive and gender-affirming healthcare, including hormone blockers, to participate in athletics, to join families through adoption, to meet basic bodily needs in restroom facilities, to have names, identities, and pronouns respected, and to learn about the existence, contributions, and persistence of same-sex desiring and gender nonconforming people through curricula in schools. And as the Trevor Project has documented recently, the onslaught of anti-LGBTQ and especially anti-trans policy and legislation is harming our youth in measurable ways, with nearly 45% of LGBTQ youth having seriously considered suicide over the past year, with even higher rates among trans youth and queer and trans youth of color. So in the mid to late 20th century, which is the period that I research, there was no coherent category of LGBT youth. The earliest gay youth groups formed outside of schools in the 1970s, and gay straight alliances, as we now know them, really just started emerging in the 1980s in schools. My current research focuses on the everyday lives and social worlds of same-sex desiring and gender nonconforming youth between about World War II and the mid-1980s, when these kind of social services began emerging. And my research follows the spatial and affective movement of youth themselves. So they encountered themselves and others, ideas, language, feelings, and experiences within their homes, in neighborhood and recreational spaces, in schools and churches, in medical offices and psychiatric institutions, in community and commercial gathering places, and in their own minds, bodies, and interactions. Each of these arenas were alive with possibilities and hazards for children and teens who felt different because of their gendered, sexual, or romantic feelings. Today, I'll focus on traumatic experiences in educational settings. As we know, schools operated with the express purpose of shaping the thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors of youth, and typically held a great deal of authority and control over children's lives. As the primary socializing institution of American youth, schools enforced conformity to gender and sexuality-based binaries and hierarchies that left queer youth vulnerable to isolation and harm. As mainstream Americans became more aware of lesbian and gay people and subcultures in the 1970s, unfortunately, scrutiny, shaming, harassment, and violence in schools often intensified, and it was driven largely by peers. Although most of my research focuses on girls and gender nonconforming youth, today I want to talk a bit about an archive of letters from the mid-1980s from gay men across the US to an 18-year-old gay male teen named Robert Rosencrantz. So Robert, in 1984, murdered his homophobic bully, who had actually worked with his younger brother to record intimate conversations he was having and attack him and his friends at his graduation party because he had other gay friends over, and he was closeted. So then Steve, the bully, and the younger brother, outed Robert to his father, and they got into a physical fight, and Robert ended up fleeing. So then what happened is, ashamed and angry, Robert began sleeping in his car and plotting revenge. He used his mother's credit card, he bought a machine gun, and he confronted Steve, who again called Robert a faggot, sorry for the horrible language. Enraged, Robert shot Steve 10 times at close range and then fled and hid for a month before surrendering himself to the police. After a well-publicized trial, he was sentenced to 17 years in prison and served longer than that, actually. And then, so a story appeared. He did an interview with The Advocate, a gay newspaper with national circulation, and he expressed deep remorse. And he invited Advocate readers to write to him in prison. And this led to an outpouring of mail from every state in the nation, creating a rich archive of gay and lesbian life, selections of which historian Gil Frank and I hope to publish eventually when we get done with our monographs. Although the affect of the letters traverses the full range of human emotion and experience, trauma weaves its way through the entire archive, including the letters that reflect on the writer's memories of school. The overwhelmingly cisgender white male letter writers describe their own school days, ranging from the 1950s through the 80s. The word that comes up over and over again is terror, and I just note that that's the term that my student used as well. These youth were terrified of being exposed as homosexual or gay in profoundly hostile school environments, and for good reason. Many of them tried to blend into the woodwork, so to speak, to keep quiet and out of the way and avoid drawing attention to themselves. For some, curiosity about themselves or other gay people or romance or attraction led them into vulnerable situations. For others, their mannerisms or hobbies or reluctance to participate in normative masculine pursuits attracted scrutiny. One 38-year-old man wrote to Robert in 1986 that, quote, he knew the pain of being gay. For me, the problem, especially in high school, was loneliness. I had a straight friend. He was a boy on whom I had a crush, the same age as me. I wanted to get closer to him physically, but I couldn't be intimate, of course. And he wrote that he remembered during his adolescence in the 1960s, the sneers, the names, the being called queer. So he said, while I had a fear of being exposed, I was mainly just bored, isolated by the straight world. Unfortunately, however, exposure usually did occur. And when it did, it typically triggered harassment, abuse, alienation, humiliation, rejection, and dehumanization. Youth reacted to these traumas in many ways, and some of which perpetuated violence, as in Robert's case. As the letters make clear, though, even those youth who avoided reacting violently to traumatic exposure and abuse understood fundamentally how Robert could have done so. So a 25-year-old man named Neil wrote, quote, I know all too well what kind of pressure you had to face when you were growing up. I faced it too. When I read what Steve Redmond had done to you, I got very upset and almost felt like his death was justified. I think it's terrible that we have to grow up and deny our sexuality until one day someone either calls us on it or something forces us to come out. When he was 13 in the early 70s, Neil fell head over heels for the 8th grade basketball all-star, and people picked up on his feelings and began taunting and verbally abusing him. It got so bad, he wrote, that I felt like killing myself, but fortunately I didn't have the guts. He got over those suicidal thoughts, but the harassment continued, and eventually he changed high schools to get away from the rumors and abuse. He did eventually come out at 17 to his family, and they were basically supportive. But Neil explicitly named his motivations for writing to Robert, saying, "By my relating my story, I hope you can see that you are not alone in your struggle for dignity and self-expression. We all go through traumas in coming out. I don't condone what you did, but I can sure understand the anger and hurt that you felt." In another letter, a 30-year-old man named Arnie described growing up in the 60s and early 70s, also in the Los Angeles area. He sensed his difference and strangeness from a very young age, which contributed to his retreat into books and schoolwork. Around 11 or 12, he recalls a dawning awareness of the source of his difference. And around age 14, he started having sex with older men, but tried to keep this hidden from school, where he was finally making some friends. And so the summer before 9th grade, he joined a community theater group whose director was a gay man in his mid-20s. And Arnie wrote that he was quite happy there. He was subject to some scrutiny in school. Other kids called him names sometimes, and his PE teacher called him queer in front of the whole class. And he said he was terrified of being outed. Nonetheless, he confided in his theater director, Jack, who seemed sympathetic, but Jack told others about Arnie, and the word got back around to kids at school. And when Arnie finally found out from a friend that these rumors were going around, he tracked down a girl in the theater group who had been spreading the rumors and hit her hard in the face. He never went back to the group. He stayed in bed for a week before returning to school. He apologized to the girl, who understandably refused to talk to him, and decided to confront his homophobic belief that, quote, it was one thing to have sex with men, but quite another to be a fag. He came out to everyone soon after that, including his parents. He minimized, he said, well, his father beat him up and still changes the subject when he brings it up, but his mother's okay. In school, he wrote an essay on gay liberation, which is incredibly brave, for his 10th grade English class, but his teacher refused to let him read it out loud, as the other students were doing, and suggested that he seek psychiatric care for his illness. He reflected that if he was 16 now, in 1986, he would make his way to a program for gay teenagers. But, quote, this was 1971, and there was nowhere to go, no one to see, and no one to talk to. A defining aspect of what I understand about trauma and post-traumatic stress is isolation. I was just thinking about this with the school shooting. One thing, I took this disaster counseling class, and the first thing that we learned is that as soon as counselors show up, the most important thing is simply to establish a connection and to allow the survivor to be seen and to feel, heard, basically, just not to be alone. But in these decades before GSAs, social services, or hotlines and the internet, this sense of being alone and disconnected and confused was ubiquitous. Although my research documents the gradual lessening of isolation over the 4 decades of my study, it remained a central, even defining feature of queer childhood and adolescence. In fact, many of the people who wrote to Robert explicitly said that they wanted him to know that he wasn't alone, even in prison, and they wanted him to know that there was a gay community out there waiting for him. Unfortunately, it was like literally being beset by HIV and AIDS in that moment. And they urged him to stay alive long enough to find that out for himself. And the length and rawness of Arnie's letter suggests that sharing his own story of surviving his high school years was part of his own healing process. Before I wrap up, because the Rosencrantz Archive centers white cis gay men, I wanted to just say a little bit about girls. There's one remarkable source, which is fun in this context to talk about. It's the undergraduate senior thesis of Susan Kahn, who, as many of you probably know, later became a respected women's and gender historian. In the late 70s, Kahn interviewed 12 young lesbians between the age of 16 and 22 for her thesis, entitled Out But Not Down, The Young Lesbian Experience. So like many other girls who appear in my research, Kahn's interviewees generally experienced less physical violence than gay boys, particularly if they were gender conforming and not particularly readable as queer. They often experienced more intense and prolonged feelings of isolation, alienation, and fear, and sometimes also sexual harassment. On the other hand, if girls' masculinity surpassed the age-based window of tolerance for tomboyishness, they could become targets of vicious verbal and sometimes physical harassment. Girls of color and white girls who socialized and formed romantic friendships with Black girls were especially vulnerable to persecution, not only by peers, but also by administrators and teachers. So Kahn interviewed a 16-year-old white girl named Teresa, for instance, whose relationship with a Black girl named Lilas became public knowledge in her San Francisco school. Fleeing virulent sexual and homophobic harassment, Teresa changed schools and got a boyfriend, though she remained lovers with Lilas. But the new school was no better. When she was late to math class one day, her teacher wrote a note to the vice principal calling her, and content warning here, little bitch, lesbian, and nigger lover. Teresa's parents then supported the school's use of the police to surveil both girls. Teresa told Kahn, quote, "They managed to get Lilas kicked off of the school grounds. They called the cops on us 3 times. I was in constant trouble. They had people keeping an eye out on me." So rather than reprimanding this math teacher for explicit homophobic and racist discrimination against a student, administrators of the San Francisco high school marshaled law enforcement in order to surveil, control, and punish Teresa and Lilas. Other teens whom Kahn interviewed had more mixed experiences, and a few even met speakers or teachers who were out as lesbians. Kahn aptly argued that even a small amount of support from both friends and teachers or administrators could make a huge difference between a terrible and a tolerable time. But she concluded, quote, "The experience of young lesbians in school still overwhelmingly consists of ostracism, repression, and isolation." And as I argue elsewhere, lesbian feminist culture typically rejected participation in social and cultural events by girls under the age of 21. So unlike teen boys, for whom, for better and for worse, sexual access to adult men sometimes enabled tenuous connections to community, queer teen girls typically face traumatic experiences in school without the benefit of adult lesbians' mentorship or support. Although there are some great exceptions to this, which I talk about elsewhere. But to my fascination, teen girls who accused adult lesbian feminists of abandoning them, and they did in the 1970s, they speculated that adult lesbians' refusal to take minor girls under their wings might be motivated, at least in part, by adults' fears of re-triggering their own adolescent traumas. The traumas of coming out in high school, it seems, could both serve as a bridge connecting people across generations and prison walls, as well as a gulf separating them from one another. In conclusion, we have so much to learn about histories of queer children and youth, including the traumas they endured and the post-traumatic growth they achieved. At the same time, queer and especially trans youth desperately need us to focus our gaze and efforts on the present moment. The results of next week's elections could improve or dramatically worsen the persecution of young people whose bodies, minds, and hearts elude or refuse binary and normative regimes of gender and sexuality. This historical moment matters just as much as any in the past. Trevor Project and other research shows what works to support our youth: affirming spaces, support from parents, teachers, and other adults, visible political advocacy and activism, and cultural representation. These factors have measurable positive impacts on the well-being of queer and trans youth. So the work that I hope we are all doing in our own spaces and spheres to support and uplift LGBTQ youth makes a difference, and we have to carry on in the midst of political chaos and precarity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we can start the discussion. I think Fredrika, and then you can start on. Fredrika?
One question to the first speaker. So I would be curious, I'm coming from Europe, so I have a European perspective, and luckily we don't yet have that many shootings in schools. But I would be curious if you could talk a bit more about the notions of masculinity and how much they feed into these, into the process of becoming a shooter. And also, what factors resulted in the marginalization and isolation of those who become shooters? So how can you prevent that process of, I don't know, turning into an outcast and then relying on shooting as a strategy to let out that frustration?
Katherine, I think that's for you. Well, it's a very, very good question. And of course, masculinity, cultural conceptions of masculinity play an enormous role here. And sadly, and I think for educators, this is the most unfortunate aspect of what we learn. For boys to be interested in school, in books, in ideas, doesn't cut it in their small towns. You know, if they are not interested in athletics, they pay a very big social price. I should say as well that it was very striking to us that adolescent boys in the age group we were looking at, so these were really young teenagers, sort of 11 to 14, vary tremendously in how much they look like the men they're going to become. Some of them look like, you know, little boys, like my children. My sons looked pretty young at that point. Others are, you know, having to shave every day, and they've already grown to much of their full height. And the social cachet of looking older and being strong and kind of beefy looking was enormous. And these boys tended to be on the more youthful side of that adolescent spectrum. And it just tells you something about social pecking orders among adolescents in the United States, which are just devastating to young boys. I would say that this is one of the reasons why we think these shootings didn't happen in big cities. Now, mind you, violence happens in big cities more often than anywhere else. This kind of shooting doesn't. And why is that? Well, we concluded that there were lots of other models for boys to be excellent at whatever they were interested in. There were more niches for them to participate, you know, in drama clubs or whatever there was. There was more variety. There was a lot more variety in big city adolescent lives than in very small town America, where there's just a real lack of that kind of variety. You know, we argued that teachers who themselves could be role models, not just LGBTQ teachers, but teachers interested in drama, could help boys who were like round holes in square pegs, and provide more opportunities for them to feel that degree of social acceptance. The saddest thing I remember from the Michael Carneal case was that he was interviewed. There's a forensic interview that we leaned on heavily, and he was asked, what did you think was going to happen after this shooting? And it became very clear from this testimony and many others I've looked at that he wasn't thinking about killing people. That wasn't what he thought. He knew that was what would happen, but he was focused on how this would ingratiate him with the cliques he was most anxious to find friendship with. So, you know, he would say, well, I thought they would come over to my house and I'd go to their house and I would have friends. And they knew it. And this is, again, one of the sad aspects, devastating aspects of this study. The social groups around these shooters that they're trying to break into are aware that they're pushing buttons, and they push them harder. So they said to Michael, oh, that gun you're bringing to school? No, we want to see a shotgun and a trench coat. They pushed him, and his desire to have friends and to feel accepted pushed him in this direction. He was deeply ambivalent. All the shooters that we've interviewed or that the FBI has interviewed display this deep ambivalence. They know that what they're going to do is wrong, but they're overwhelmed with this desire to be part of a friendship network, to be socially accepted, and the people around them are telling them exactly how to do that. They start getting the attention they so desperately want when they start talking about shooting people. If that's not a sick aspect of our culture, I don't know what is. But it is God's truth that they know so much how to push those buttons that in many of these cases, the authorities consider charging those young people as accessories. They generally don't get charged, but the authorities think about it because there's a lot of evidence that they're involved in a kind of, it's not exactly a plot, but it's an egging on
Katherine, can I just
and
ask?
they will say, "Oh, we were just kidding. We were just kidding. We didn't mean it." And that may well be true, but we need to teach adolescents sometimes the things you say have real consequences.
Katherine, am I right that you're talking about wanting to be part of a group? Because, of course, the Columbine killers and even Leopold and Lowe back in the 1920s were a duo. So it's not enough that they would have a friend or a colleague. They wanted to be part of a group.
There are two things. They wanted to be accepted by someone. I mean, not necessarily a group, but they wanted to have some friends. But I must say, they also felt, and this is where the Columbine example was very apposite. They're often suicidal, but they're not individually suicidal. They want to go out with a blaze of anti-hero glory. They fantasize about how they'll be remembered. They want to be notorious, because being notorious is socially a step above being a rejected dweeb.
Right.
And that was very true of the Columbine killers as well. Notoriety, they imagined how in their, after their death or whatever, they would be seen as anti-heroes. And it is a sad thing that anti-hero status is much higher than being a rejected boy.
Steve?
You are unique.
Kathy, can I ask a question about this?
Sure.
I remember reading your book, and it really made me take a step back and ask a lot of hard questions about the country and the way that we were bringing up kids, especially boys. But to the point of the first question about Europe, there have been shootings in Canada and the UK and some other countries, but
Germany.
Yeah, Germany, right. But not to the same degree as the United States. And, if you ask most people in my political party why that would be, right, the first thing they'll point to is guns and their availability. Is that a fair explanation, or is there something more than that? Because
I think there is honestly something more, but because guns matter in a way that I think people don't necessarily understand. The growth in gun ownership in the United States has not been the spread of guns to people who don't own them. It's been the acquisition of more guns among the people who already do. So from my point of view, it's not a great explanation for how this has increased in the US. But what I would say is this: I think gun control, because I am part of your political party, I do think it's very, very important, but for reasons different from the ones that their advocates suggest. So advocates think that gun control is going to keep guns out of the hands of people. I'm sorry to say, I don't think that it will. But what gun control does is make it more difficult to acquire a gun. Not impossible, just more difficult. And if you are an ambivalent teenager with not a lot of organizational resources, anything that frustrates your attempt to get a hold of guns is going to help retard some of these horrible events. A truly dedicated killer will get their hands on guns. And that's why intercepting information is so important, because those people cannot, Andrew Golden and his collaborator took a blowtorch to a safe containing guns. And when that didn't work, they got wire clippers and unclipped. Anyway, the point is, if you're highly, highly motivated to get your hand on a gun, you can do that in the United States. And I doubt there's going to be very much that we can do to stop that. But what gun control does is make it more difficult for people who aren't quite as highly motivated. And sad to say, these are very rare events. Even now, they're very rare events. They're terrible, but they're still relatively rare. The harder we make it for someone to execute one of these events, the better off we'll all be. It just won't be zero.
That makes total sense to me. I guess I'm
Allow Johanna Michlich to come in, perhaps.
Joanna?
Joanna?
Yes, please.
sorry.
Joanna? There you go.
Oh, thank you for this fascinating talk. One question to Katherine. Actually, I work in a totally different field, but what you have said about the communities and dealing with traumas or not dealing, turning away from traumas, resonate with my research. And you have argued very well about the idea that we have to encourage the young people to come forward when they see the coming forward, yes, emerging trauma. And yet I wonder if in a culture in which actually we don't want to deal with difficult, painful, challenging issues, family on an individual, individual level, small community level, how would you do it? And would the child also think that his voice matter, and who would listen to him?
Well, what we found was that if it's a public process, they won't. That's too risky. If it's a quiet, private, confidential process that they have some confidence in, they do. And so I do think that that's a really important resource we have to put in front of kids, because if they're so scared that they don't come to school, they're scared enough to do something as long as that something doesn't subject them to a huge social penalty when they're dealing with information that is so vague. I mean, if someone says to you, you'll see who lives or dies on Monday, and it's somebody who's always saying crazy things, you say, well, do I know? What do I know? Well, what I know is I'm a little scared of that guy, but I don't come forward with information, quite like that. But I do think if you provide that resource, it will make a difference. And the other thing that I'm sorry to say, I do think we need to do is we need to remind every new cohort of kids this sort of thing happens. Because in a few years, in 3 years, you've got a whole new crop of kids in high school. They don't know what happened. And is it real? Is it something that happens? Well, we adults who are, repositories of decades of information that's come our way and it's still stuck up here, remember all of this. But young people don't know what happened before they got onto the scene, and they have to be told. If you hear something that troubles you this much, rely on your instincts. Tell someone. I will finish with a little anecdote. I was writing this book when my son, who is now 33 and a postdoc, when he was in second grade. And when he was in second grade, he knew what I was working on because we'd talk about it at dinner time. He'd come home from school, and one day he said to me, there's a kid in my class who has cut his wrists. And he showed everybody that he had cut his wrists. And I said, David, don't you think we should talk to someone about this? This, maybe it's nothing, but it could be very serious. And if you never came forward and you knew this, you would feel terrible. And he instantly, knowing I had been working on this project for 2 years, said, oh no, what if I get in trouble? What if everybody knows it was me? What if this was nothing and he's just showing up? What if? There were 1,000 what ifs. It was testimony of how strong that ambivalence is.
Catherine, I had a question.
But I went forward and told the teacher myself.
We have two more questions here, so please.
Should I go ahead? So Catherine, I'm just a little concerned about, the idea of tell someone. It isn't clear to me what happens once that person is told. First of all, the psychologist, every therapist I know in the world has a waiting list. So nobody has any time. The city and county resources are very poorly funded. You're also saying that the parents are in denial or they don't want to face it. So tell somebody, and what happens? In California, there could be I don't know what it's called in other states, 5150 involuntary hold for maybe 1 week, maybe 2 weeks tops, and then they're released. The long-term psychiatric care is no longer available unless the parents have the resources to involuntary. They can't even involuntary. They could involuntary hospitalize a minor, but other than that, so what?
Your points are very well taken, and I would be the first to agree with you that we are not a very well organized society. In fact, we've gone in the wrong direction because we looked at the caseloads of high school guidance counselors, which were just zooming up, 1 to 500 kids, and we were going to expect these people to. But that said, we did find that school resource officers were effective, and they were effective for several reasons. Their job is to hang around and make friends with kids and be unobtrusive, and they're not armed. They're, sort of soft cops, but they were respected, and they were understood as people you could turn to because they were independent of the school disciplinary bureaucracy. The second point I would make, and this I found really fascinating, there's very little documented material on people who come forward because, generally speaking, if they come forward, there's not an incident that then attracts a lot of media attention, right? The shooting doesn't happen. But in those cases where we were able to find evidence across the country of who came forward, it was always girls. Girls came forward. Boys did not come forward. The girls who were attached to these boys' networks, because the girls did maintain relationships with teachers they cared about, people they didn't want to see hurt. And they were the ones who came forward. If we know anything about the gender of who comes forward, was 100% of the time, it was girls. And that tells you something, and this doesn't mean girls are perfect or that they're wonderful to each other. Girls have lots of ways of being devastatingly horrible to one another. It just doesn't happen to be this way. So figuring out ways to enable kids to come forward just seemed to us to be more effective than the police response. It's really in contrast to that law enforcement response, which is too late, almost always too late.
I just want to inform you that, being a party pooper here, that the time is out now. So
No, we have 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, my time is not out. Well,
I'd like to speak to the point of prevention. Yeah. So before boys get to even that point, so practices like restorative practices where you build community, where all kids get a voice, all kids get to be heard, can really be helpful to reducing bullying and also building friendships and building community so that folks don't get to the point of isolation and wanting to get attention, going to extreme points to get attention.
I thought that was
right.
Yeah, I thought that was a point that was interesting in that what does it say about our society that little kids can't wait to tell an adult on each other? I mean, he did bite it. That's just part of it. And then there's some point where in our socialization to become an adult, or at least at this point, an adolescent, even someone whose sexual identity is something that maybe they need to discuss with an older person, they don't feel that they can do it. Their own sexual identity. So, that seems to be something that's universal through what everyone's talking about. And I don't know if we're going to come up with any answers with that by the end of tomorrow, but I hope so.
We'll solve it. Katherine, as a university administrator, you are where the buck stops, right?
Yes.
And you have to worry about issues that all of us worry about in the abstract, but you have to worry about them in the concrete. Hazing, potential violence, mental health issues, suicidal ideation, and the like. In 1 minute.
That's why you don't want my job, Stephen.
Since the buck does stop, in a sense, with you, and you are on the firing line, how do you think about this?
I think we are able to be more constructive about this with college students than we are with high school students. The one job I wouldn't want to have is to be a high school principal or superintendent. It's so difficult. At the university level, we are able to bring a lot more resources to it. It's not perfect by any means. We have, catastrophic levels of anxiety and depression now, as a consequence of the pandemic, and we had it before that. But I think we do have mental health staff, right? There are no mental health staff in high schools. They're guidance counselors. They have no training in mental health. I think there are other things we can do at the high school level to structure the sharing of information, even when it's not really organized for this purpose. So, for example, where there's team teaching, when you have high school history teachers and literature teachers together in team teaching humanities or whatever it is they're doing, it brings two people together that have observations of students together to collaborate on something else, which is producing a class or a curriculum. But it does provide an occasion when multiple eyes are on the same kids. And so I do think there are some ways to structure how schools deliver even pedagogy that increase the likelihood of information sharing. And information sharing is so critical. I mean, Michael Carneal wrote stories for his English teacher. These were creative writing assignments. And in those creative writing assignments, he wrote about killing people in great bloody detail, using the real names of the students in his classes. Did that teacher ever share that essay with anyone? No, she didn't. Why? Well, it wasn't a practice to do that. And, was this just fantasy or what? Well, if that teacher had been able to talk to the people who knew that he was looking at pornography in the library, who saw him stomping on fish in the biology class, they would have begun to see this was somebody who needed help. This is someone who needed help, and there was no help going to him.
Can I ask one final question? You did a lot of this before there was an explosion of social media.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could talk a bit. We read in the newspapers that so much of this is discussed out there in social media, and you're wondering who are the kids who put this online? Is anyone policing this? What is the responsibility of the school, of the local police department? It's just again and again and again, you see all of this stuff has basically appeared somewhere.
You are so right, and that is such an important point. And yes, this work was done before social media was really a thing. But after the Sandy Hook shooting, the National Science Foundation asked me to pull together everybody I could find who'd done any research on this. And by that time, social media was definitely a thing. And so I brought together people from the computer science, from the data science community, to ask them, how good are we at tracking stuff? Because, for example, we can now spot flu epidemics because we can see that people have been looking for, I don't know what, aspirin or something. We do have techniques for scraping off the web and finding patterns in that data. So I asked them, are there ways for you to identify bullying? Are there, not post hoc, but while it's going on in the same kind of almost infection mode that you would see for a flu epidemic? And sadly, what they told me was not really. We could probably get from the whole haystack down to 1,000 people, but down to one, no, we're not able to do that. Now, who knows? Maybe in time with artificial intelligence, there will be other methods, and no doubt there will be lots of concerns about liberty and privacy and so on that would make it complicated even if we had the technology. But it is certainly the case that people are viewing stuff. And, maybe if we use the same principles that I've been advocating for to enable school kids to come forward about enabling people who see, threatening stuff online to come forward. I mean, one of the shooters, I've forgotten if it was the Uvalde shooter, it might have been in Uvalde, had a German, Lorna, do you remember this? A German sort of, not pen pal, but internet partner.
Right.
Who did get, I think it was Uvalde, who got worried enough that she actually did try to alert someone and couldn't figure out who, because she was overseas.
Yes, that was
anyway,
Uvalde.
We need to do more to think about what can people do if they get worried enough. And then we have to recognize 99 times out of 100, that's going to be a false alarm. And we have to be willing to tolerate the energy and expense of tracking down false alarms, because 1 in 100, it might be something.
That's so true. Sounds like the Stasi, I don't know.
Well, perhaps we should wind this up now,
Yes,
right?
yes, now we should wind it up. But the good news is that we're back tomorrow, and we look forward to seeing all of you and talking some more. We're going to talk about displacement. We're going to talk about children in war. I hope that Jonathan and Katherine will join us if you possibly can, because it's been delightful to have you here. And for the people who are here, thank you.
The depressing aspect is that when the things goes on in the places where the guns are not easily available, like the two latest events in Sweden, they all use knives. And in terms of intelligence, it turned out actually that the US monitoring of internet traffic actually informed from Washington to the Swedish authorities about something that might be going on eventually. So which is kind of a scary aspect of the monitoring of international communication traffic, which is kind of another aspect of this. But there are, I don't think that there's a point about discussing guns I mean, guns are available in other nations, but they're not always used. So there's something about masculinity and guns and stuff like that that also goes. Thank you very much.
Have a good dinner.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.